Imagine a man born into the ruling family of a vast empire, raised in wealth and privilege, accustomed from his youth to luxury and comfort, who could be recognized, it is said, by the costly perfume that lingered in the streets where he had walked. Imagine a young man fond of fine clothes and fragrance, surrounded by every comfort his high birth could provide, with the wealth of an empire at his fingertips. And then imagine that same man, raised to the highest office in that empire, the ruler of a realm that stretched across 3 continents, choosing, at the very moment of his greatest power, to give it all away. Imagine a ruler who, on becoming the head of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, set aside the luxury in which he had been raised, gave up his fine clothes and his costly perfumes, surrendered his wealth and his estates, and chose instead a life of simplicity and self-denial, living more humbly than many of his own subjects. Imagine a ruler who took the riches he had been given, the jewels and the treasures, and placed them into the public treasury, who restored to their rightful owners the lands and properties his family had wrongly taken, who gave back what had been seized, even at the cost of impoverishing his own relatives and making bitter enemies of the powerful. Imagine a ruler so concerned for justice that he would not take for himself or his family even the smallest thing that rightly belonged to the people, who was seen, by the accounts, to refuse an apple given to his own child, because it had come from the public funds, who extinguished the lamp of the state when his own private affairs were discussed, unwilling to use even the oil of the public treasury for his own concerns. Imagine a ruler whose justice and whose reforms so threatened the powerful and the privileged that, in the end, they conspired against him. And he died, by the accounts, poisoned by those whose wealth and privilege he had curtailed, forgiving even his killer as he lay dying. This is the story of such a man. His name was Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, and he is remembered as one of the most just rulers in the history of his civilization, so revered for his justice and his piety that he came to be regarded as a kind of fifth among the rightly guided caliphs, the early successors who were held to have ruled with exemplary justice. He was a caliph of the Umayyad dynasty, which ruled a vast empire more than 1,300 years ago, and yet he stood apart from the other rulers of his house, remembered not for the pursuit of power and luxury, but for justice, piety, and the giving back of what others sought to take. We will follow his whole life tonight, slowly and gently, from his birth into the ruling family, his youth of privilege and luxury, his service as a governor, his unexpected rise to the highest office, his remarkable transformation, and his reign of justice and reform, and the close of his short but extraordinary rule. It is a story about justice, about the renunciation of power and wealth for the sake of what is right, about a ruler who gave back what others sought to seize, who placed justice above his own advantage and the advantage of his family. And through it all runs a quiet question, gentle and enduring. What does it mean to hold power justly, to use it for others rather than oneself, to give back rather than to take? So settle in and let your mind grow calm. There is no hurry here. We have a long and peaceful journey ahead, through a distant world and a single remarkable life. You do not need to remember every name or every date. You only need to rest, and to listen, and to let this old story carry you gently towards sleep. Wherever you are, however tired you feel, you are welcome here. Let the cares of the day grow quiet, and let us travel back together to a world that is more than 1,300 years old. Perhaps you have felt, in some quiet moment of your own, the pull of the question that this man's life poses. What it would mean to use whatever power or advantage we have not for ourselves but for others, to give rather than to take, to place justice above our own interest. Most of us are not rulers of empires, but all of us have some measure of power or advantage, some position in which we might choose to serve ourselves or to serve others, to take what we can or to give what we should. Omar faced this choice on the grandest scale, with the wealth and power of an empire at his disposal, and he chose, remarkably, to give rather than to take, to serve rather than to be served. There is a quiet inspiration, as the night settles, in keeping company with such a ruler. So as we begin the long walk back through his life, carry no burden of effort. You are not being asked to study or to remember. You are being invited to rest, and to let an old and true story unfold at its own unhurried pace, the way the night itself unfolds, slowly and gently, toward the quiet of deep sleep. We will move softly, and there is nothing you need to do but listen, and let the calm of it settle over you like a blanket drawn up in the dark. To understand the man, we must first understand the world that made him, and the dynasty into which he was born. We must travel back to the late 7th and early 8th centuries, to the great empire ruled by the Umayyad dynasty, one of the largest empires the world had then seen, stretching across 3 continents, from the lands of Spain in the west to the borders of India and Central Asia in the east. It was a vast and powerful realm, and the family that ruled it, the Umayyads, were among the most powerful people on earth. The Umayyad dynasty had come to power in the decades after the founding of the faith, and ruled the vast empire that the early expansion of the faith had created. They ruled from their capital in Damascus, in Syria, governing the vast realm through a system of provincial governors, commanding great armies, controlling immense wealth. They were a powerful and wealthy dynasty, ruling one of the great empires of the age, and the members of the ruling family lived in corresponding wealth and privilege, surrounded by the luxury that the riches of the empire could provide. But the Umayyad period was also a time of tension and discontent, for the rule of the dynasty was not universally accepted, and many among the people felt that the rulers had departed from the principles of justice and piety that the faith required. Some felt that the Umayyad rulers placed their own power and the interests of their family above the principles of the faith and the welfare of the people, that they had become worldly rulers concerned with power and wealth rather than just and pious leaders. There was discontent, in particular, among the non-Arab converts to the faith, who felt that they were treated as second-class members of the community, taxed unjustly, denied the equality that the faith promised. And there was a current of pious opposition among the devout, who longed for rulers who would govern with the justice and piety of the early days of the faith. It was into this world that Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz was born. The vast and powerful Umayyad Empire, ruled by a wealthy and powerful dynasty from its capital in Damascus, but troubled by discontent and a longing, among many, for rulers who would govern with justice and piety. He was born into the ruling family itself, a member of the powerful Umayyad dynasty, raised in wealth and privilege, and yet he would become the ruler who, more than any other of his house, answered the longing for justice and piety, who governed not for the power and wealth of his family, but for the justice and welfare of the people, who became the great exception among the rulers of his dynasty. Let us dwell a while longer on the great empire that Umar would come to rule, for it was one of the largest and most powerful realms the world had then seen, and understanding it helps us to grasp the magnitude of the power he held and the significance of how he chose to use it. The Umayyad Empire of Umar's age stretched across an immense expanse, from the lands of the far west to the borders of the distant east. In the west, the empire reached across the whole of North Africa, along the southern shore of the Mediterranean, and beyond, into the lands of Spain, which the armies of the dynasty had conquered. In the east, it stretched across Arabia and the Middle East, through Persia and into Central Asia, reaching toward the borders of India and the lands of the distant east. It was a vast realm, spanning 3 continents, encompassing many lands and many peoples, one of the largest empires the world had then seen. To rule such a realm was to hold power over an immense expanse, over many millions of people, over the wealth and resources of a vast empire. The empire was ruled from its capital in Damascus, the great city in Syria that the Umayyad dynasty had made the seat of their power. From Damascus, the rulers governed the vast realm, directing its administration, commanding its armies, controlling its wealth. The capital was a great and magnificent city, the center of the empire's power, adorned with the wealth that flowed in from the vast realm, home to the ruling family and the apparatus of their government. It was a center of power and wealth and magnificence, the heart of the great empire, from which the rulers governed their immense domain. The empire was governed through a system of provincial administration, the vast realm divided into provinces, each ruled by a governor appointed by the Caliph. These governors held great power in their provinces, administering them on behalf of the Caliph, collecting the taxes, maintaining order, commanding the local forces. The system of provincial governors allowed the central government to rule the vast realm, extending its authority across the immense expanse through the appointed governors. But it also created opportunities for abuse, for the governors might rule unjustly, exploit the people, enrich themselves through corruption. And the justice of the empire's governance depended greatly on the character of the governors and the oversight of the central government. The empire commanded immense wealth, drawn from the vast lands it ruled, from the taxes of its many peoples, from the spoils of its conquests, from the trade that flowed through its territories. This wealth filled the treasury of the empire, funded its armies and its administration, and supported the luxury of the ruling family. The Umayyad rulers and their family lived in great wealth, surrounded by luxury, enjoying the riches that flowed in from the vast empire. The control of this immense wealth was one of the great powers of the rulers, and the question of how it was used, whether for the welfare of the people or the luxury of the rulers, was one of the central questions of just governance. And the empire was home to many peoples, of many origins and faiths, brought together under the rule of the dynasty. There were the Arab Muslims, the original bearers of the faith and the ruling people of the empire. There were the many non-Arab converts to the faith, who had embraced the religion but were often treated as second-class members of the community. And there were the many peoples of other faiths, the Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and others, who lived under the rule of the empire, retaining their own religions. The empire was a vast and diverse realm, home to many peoples of many origins and faiths, and the just governance of this diverse realm, the fair treatment of its many peoples, was one of the great challenges of rule. This, then, was the empire that Umar would come to rule. A vast realm spanning 3 continents, governed from the magnificent capital of Damascus through a system of provincial governors, commanding immense wealth, home to many peoples of many origins and faiths. To rule such an empire was to hold immense power over a vast expanse, over many millions of people, over the wealth and resources of a great realm. And the question of how this power was used, whether justly or unjustly, for the welfare of the people or the aggrandizement of the rulers, was the central question that Umar would answer, in his own remarkable way, when he came to hold the supreme power of this vast empire. We should hold in mind, as we follow Umar's story, the magnitude of the power he held, the vastness of the empire he ruled, the immense wealth at his disposal. For it is against this background that the significance of his choices appears. He held the supreme power of a vast empire, with its immense wealth at his disposal, and he chose to use this power and this wealth not for himself or his family, but for the welfare of the people, giving back his wealth, governing with justice. The magnitude of the power he held makes the significance of how he used it all the greater, the ruler of a vast empire choosing to give rather than to take, to serve rather than to be served, to use his immense power as a trust for the welfare of the people. So let us leave the wider world behind now, and turn toward the ruling family of the great empire, into which a child was born who would become its most just and pious ruler. The child who would become Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz was born around the year 682, by most accounts in the city of Medina, the city of the Prophet, though some accounts place his birth in Egypt, where his father served as governor. He was born into the ruling Umayyad family, a member of the powerful dynasty that ruled the vast empire, the son of a man who governed the great province of Egypt. From his birth, then, he belonged to the highest ranks of the empire, a member of the ruling family. The son of a powerful governor, born to wealth and privilege. His lineage was distinguished on both sides, for his father's family were the ruling dynasty. His mother's line was even more revered, for through his mother, Omar was a descendant of one of the most revered figures of the early faith, a great-grandson, by the accounts, of an early caliph renowned for his justice, one of the rightly guided successors who were held to have ruled with exemplary justice and piety. This descent from a revered ancestor known for justice would later be emphasized by those who told Umar's story, for it seemed to prefigure the justice for which Umar himself would become renowned, as though the justice of the revered ancestor had descended to the great-grandson who would govern with the same justice. A beautiful story tells how this lineage came to be, which we may treasure as a tradition whatever its precise historical truth. It is said that the revered ancestor, the just early Caliph, while walking at night to observe the condition of his people, as was his custom, overheard a woman instructing her daughter to dilute the milk they sold, to cheat their customers. The daughter refused, saying that though the Caliph could not see them, the lord of the Caliph could. The Caliph, impressed by the girl's honesty and piety, later arranged for her to marry into his family, and from this union, the tradition relates, descended Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, inheriting the honesty and piety of the girl who would not cheat even when she thought no one was watching. Whatever the precise truth of this story, it expresses the tradition's sense of Umar's inheritance of justice and piety from his revered lineage. The young Umar was raised, then, in wealth and privilege, a member of the ruling family, surrounded by the luxury that his high birth provided. And in his youth, by the accounts, he was fond of the things that wealth could provide, of fine clothes and costly perfumes, of the comforts and pleasures of his privileged life. He was known, it is said, for his fondness of fragrance, so that the costly perfume he wore would linger in the streets where he had walked, marking the passage of the wealthy young prince. He was a young man of fashion and luxury, fond of the fine things his privilege provided, living the comfortable and privileged life of a member of the ruling family. But alongside this youthful fondness for luxury, Umar also received a thorough education, particularly in the religious sciences of his faith, for he was sent to Medina, the city of the Prophet, a great center of religious learning, to be educated. There, in the city that was the heart of the faith's scholarship, he studied under learned teachers, absorbing the religious sciences, the knowledge of the sacred text and the traditions, the principles of the faith. He received, that is, a thorough religious education, becoming himself a scholar of some learning, deeply versed in the religious sciences, even as he enjoyed the luxury of his privileged life. This religious learning would later prove important, providing the foundation of knowledge and principle on which his just rule would be based. As he came to manhood, Umar entered the service of the dynasty, taking up the responsibilities of a member of the ruling family. And in time he was appointed to an important position, the governorship of the region of the Hijaz, the part of Arabia that contained the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the heartland of the faith. This was an important governorship, the rule of the sacred heartland of the faith, and Umar held it for some years, governing the holy cities and their region. It was his first major experience of rule, his first exercise of governmental responsibility, and it gave him experience of governance that would later serve him as caliph. And even as governor, the accounts relate, Umar showed signs of the justice and piety that would later mark his reign. He governed the holy cities with care and justice, and he established, by the accounts, a practice that would characterize his later rule. He formed a council of pious and learned men to advise him, consulting the devout and the learned on the right governance of his province. This consultation of the pious, this seeking of counsel from the devout and learned, reflected his concern for just and righteous governance, his desire to rule according to the principles of the faith. Already as governor, then, Umar showed the concern for justice and piety, the seeking of righteous governance, that would later characterize his reign as Caliph. This period of his life, his youth of privilege and his service as governor, established the foundations of the man he would become. He was a member of the ruling family, raised in wealth and privilege, fond in his youth of luxury and comfort. But he was also a scholar of the religious sciences, educated in the principles of the faith, and a governor who showed concern for justice and righteous rule. The privileged young prince who loved luxury was also a learned scholar and a just governor, and these two aspects of his early life, the privilege and the piety, would meet in the great transformation that came when he rose to the highest office, when the prince who had loved luxury chose, as Caliph, the path of justice and renunciation. The great turning point of Umar's life came with his unexpected elevation to the highest office of the empire, the caliphate, the supreme rule of the vast realm. It came about in an unusual way, for Umar was not the obvious or expected successor, not a son of the ruling caliph, but a more distant member of the family. Yet the caliph who ruled before him, on his deathbed, named Umar as his successor, passing over his own sons to designate this kinsman known for his piety and learning. And so, around the year 717, Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz unexpectedly became the caliph, the supreme ruler of the vast Umayyad Empire. There is a saying attributed to Umar that captures, perhaps better than any other, the deepest spring of his character, the restless aspiration that drove him from the love of luxury to the love of justice, and finally to the love of the highest good. It is worth dwelling on, for it reveals the inner movement of his soul. By the accounts, Umar once described himself as a man of insatiable ambition, who, no sooner than he attained one object he longed for, set his heart on a still higher one. In his youth, he said, he had longed for the fine things of the world, and attained them. Then he had longed for high office, the governorship, and attained it. Then he had longed for the highest office of all, the caliphate, and attained it. And now, having attained the highest office the world could offer, his ambition aspired to something higher still, the highest good of all, the pleasure of God and the reward of the hereafter, after which nothing remained to be desired. His ambition, having exhausted the objects of the world, now aspired to the highest good beyond the world. A profound insight into Umar's character lives in this saying, this account of an insatiable ambition that rose from one object to a higher, until it aspired to the highest good of all. For it reveals the inner movement of his soul, the restless aspiration that could not be satisfied by any object short of the highest, that rose from the love of luxury to the love of office to the love, finally, of the highest good. His transformation from the prince of luxury to the just and pious ruler was, in this light, not a reversal of his ambition but its fulfillment, the rising of his insatiable aspiration from the lower objects to the highest, from the love of the world to the love of the highest good. This insight helps us to understand the unity beneath the apparent transformation of Umar's life. For it might seem that the prince of luxury and the austere just ruler were two different men, the one given to the world and the other renouncing it. But in light of this saying, we see a unity beneath the transformation, the same insatiable aspiration driving both, rising from the lower objects to the higher, from the love of luxury to the love of the highest good. The aspiration that had driven him to seek the fine things of the world was the same aspiration that drove him, having exhausted the world, to seek the highest good, the pleasure of God, after which nothing remained to be desired. The transformation was the fulfillment of his aspiration, its rising to the highest object. Something speaks to a deep truth about the human heart in this. The truth that our deepest aspiration cannot be satisfied by any object short of the highest, that we rise, if we follow our aspiration truly, from the lower objects to the higher, until we aspire to the highest good of all. For the human heart, in its deepest aspiration, is restless until it finds the highest good, unsatisfied by any lesser object, driven from one attainment to a higher, until it reaches the highest. Umar's saying expresses this truth, this restless aspiration of the human heart for the highest good, this rising from the lower objects to the higher, until nothing remains to be desired, but the highest good of all. And we might reflect on our own aspirations in this light, on whether we, like Umar, allow our aspiration to rise from the lower objects to the higher, or whether we rest content with lower objects, never aspiring to the highest good. For many of us, perhaps, rest content with the lower objects, the fine things of the world, the attainments of position and wealth, never allowing our aspiration to rise to the highest good. Umar's example, his rising aspiration that could not rest content with any object short of the highest, calls us to allow our own aspiration to rise, not to rest content with lower objects, but to aspire to the highest good, the good that alone can satisfy the deepest aspiration of the human heart. We should note, too, the way this rising aspiration was joined, in Umar, to a deep humility and a sense of accountability, so that his aspiration to the highest good expressed itself not in pride, but in service, not in self-aggrandizement, but in the just use of his power for others. His aspiration to the highest good, the pleasure of God, expressed itself in justice, in the service of the people, in the just use of his power. For he understood that the highest good was attained not through self-aggrandizement, but through righteousness, through the just discharge of his responsibilities, through the service of those his power affected. His rising aspiration to the highest good was joined to humility and service, expressing itself in just rule rather than self-aggrandizement. So we may see in this saying, this account of an insatiable aspiration rising from the lower objects to the highest good, the deepest spring of Umar's character, the inner movement of his soul that underlay his transformation from the prince of luxury to the just and pious ruler. His aspiration rose from the love of the world to the love of the highest good, and this rising aspiration, joined to humility and a sense of accountability, expressed itself in his just rule, his service of the people, his righteous use of his power. The deepest spring of his character was this aspiration to the highest good, which drove his transformation and grounded his just rule, the restless aspiration of a soul that could not rest content with any object short of the highest good of all. The accounts relate that Umar received this elevation not with joy but with a profound sense of the weight of the responsibility laid upon him. For he understood the caliphate not as a prize to be enjoyed, but as a tremendous trust, a responsibility for which he would answer before God, the charge of ruling justly over the vast empire and its many peoples. By the accounts, when he understood that he had been made caliph, he was filled not with elation, but with a sense of the awesome burden he now bore, the responsibility for the welfare and the just governance of the empire, the accountability before God for how he would rule. He wept, by the accounts, at the weight of the trust, understanding the gravity of the responsibility he now bore. And from the very beginning of his reign, Umar underwent a remarkable transformation, setting aside the luxury and privilege in which he had been raised, embracing instead a life of simplicity and self-denial. The prince who had loved fine clothes and costly perfumes now put aside his luxury, dressed simply, lived humbly, renounced the comforts and pleasures of his former life. The transformation was dramatic and complete, the wealthy prince become a simple and austere ruler, living more humbly than many of his own subjects, having set aside the luxury of his former life for the sake of the responsibility he now bore. The accounts relate many stories of this transformation, of the dramatic change in Umar's way of life when he became caliph. It is said that he gave up his fine clothes for simple garments, his luxurious living for austere simplicity, his costly comforts for a humble way of life. It is said that he who had been known for his costly perfume now lived in such simplicity that nothing distinguished him from the humblest of his subjects. The transformation was complete, the luxury of the prince entirely set aside for the simplicity of the just and pious ruler, the wealthy young man of fashion become an austere and humble caliph. The transformation that Umar underwent when he became caliph, the change from the prince of luxury to the austere and just ruler, is one of the most remarkable features of his story, and it deserves our deeper reflection, for it reveals much about the nature of true change and the power of responsibility to transform a soul. Consider the magnitude of the transformation. The young Umar had been a prince of luxury, fond of fine clothes and costly perfumes, accustomed to every comfort his high birth provided, living the privileged life of a member of the ruling family. He was a young man of fashion and fragrance, known for the costly perfume that lingered where he walked, enjoying the wealth and the pleasures of his privileged position. This was the Umar of his youth, the prince of luxury, fond of the fine things his privilege provided. And then, when he became caliph, this prince of luxury transformed himself into an austere and simple ruler, setting aside his fine clothes and costly perfumes, his luxury and comfort, embracing a life of simplicity and self-denial so complete that he lived more humbly than many of his subjects. The transformation was dramatic and total. The prince of luxury become the austere ruler, the man of fashion and fragrance become the simple and humble caliph. It was as though he had become a different man, the luxury of his youth entirely set aside, replaced by a simplicity and austerity that astonished those who had known him. What brought about this remarkable transformation? It was, by the accounts, the weight of the responsibility that he now bore, the awesome trust of ruling the vast empire, the accountability before God for how he would govern. When Umar became caliph, he understood the caliphate not as a prize to be enjoyed, but as a tremendous responsibility, a trust for which he would answer before God, the charge of ruling justly over the vast empire and its many peoples. And this understanding of his responsibility transformed him, calling forth from him a seriousness, a self-denial, a devotion to justice that the prince of luxury had not shown. The weight of the trust transformed the man, calling forth the just ruler from the prince of luxury. A profound truth lives in this, about the power of responsibility to transform a soul, to call forth from a person depths they had not shown before. The young Umar, in his life of privilege and luxury, had not shown the seriousness and self-denial and devotion to justice that he would show as caliph. But when the great responsibility was laid upon him, when he understood the trust he now bore, these qualities were called forth from him, the responsibility transforming the man, summoning depths that the comfortable life of privilege had never required. The weight of the trust made him a different man, calling forth the just and serious ruler from the prince of luxury. Consider this power of responsibility to transform, to call forth depths we had not shown, to summon from us a seriousness and a devotion that easier circumstances had never required. For many of us perhaps carry within us depths that have not been called forth, qualities that easier circumstances have never required, a capacity for seriousness and devotion and self-denial that has not been summoned. And it may be that responsibility, the laying upon us of a great trust, can call forth these depths, can summon from us qualities we had not shown, can transform us as the weight of the caliphate transformed Umar. The responsibility we bear can be the occasion of our transformation, calling forth from us depths we had not known we possessed. And we might reflect, too, on the seriousness with which Umar regarded his responsibility, the depth of his sense of the trust he bore, and the accountability he faced. For it was this seriousness, this profound sense of responsibility and accountability, that transformed him, that called forth his justice and his self-denial. He understood his power not as a possession to be enjoyed, but as a trust to be discharged, not as a prize to be exploited, but as a responsibility for which he would answer before God. And this serious understanding of his responsibility was the source of his transformation, the foundation of his just rule, the reason he used his power for the welfare of the people rather than his own aggrandizement. There is a lesson in this for all who hold any responsibility, any trust, any power over the welfare of others. It is the lesson of the serious regard for responsibility, the understanding of power as a trust to be discharged, rather than a possession to be enjoyed, the sense of accountability for how we use whatever authority we hold. Umar regarded his power with this seriousness, understood it as a trust for which he would answer, and this serious understanding transformed him and grounded his just rule. And his example calls all who hold responsibility to a similar seriousness, a similar understanding of power as a trust, a similar sense of accountability for how we use whatever authority we hold over the welfare of others. So we may see in Umar's transformation, the change from the prince of luxury to the austere and just ruler, not merely a remarkable change of personal habits, but the transforming power of responsibility seriously regarded, the calling forth of depths by the weight of a great trust. The prince of luxury became the just ruler because he regarded his power with profound seriousness, understood it as a trust for which he would answer, and let this understanding transform him. His transformation testifies to the power of responsibility to transform a soul, and his example calls all who hold responsibility to the serious regard for their trust that transformed the prince of luxury into one of the most just rulers in the history of his civilization. But Umar's transformation went far beyond his personal way of life, for he set about, from the beginning of his reign, to give back the wealth that he and his family had accumulated, to restore what had been wrongly taken, to surrender the riches that he believed did not rightfully belong to him. He took the wealth that had come to him, the jewels and treasures and estates, and placed them into the public treasury, surrendering his private riches to the common good. He believed that the wealth of the ruler should belong to the people, held in trust for the common good, not accumulated for the private benefit of the ruler and his family. And he acted on this belief, giving back his wealth to the public treasury. And he went further, for he set about to restore the lands and properties that the Umayyad family had wrongly taken, to return to their rightful owners what had been unjustly seized. The members of the ruling family had, over the years, accumulated great wealth and vast estates, some of it acquired through the abuse of their power, the seizure of properties, the taking of what did not rightfully belong to them. And Umar set about to undo these injustices, to restore the wrongly taken properties to their rightful owners, to return what had been unjustly seized. This was a remarkable and courageous act, for it meant taking wealth from the powerful members of his own family, undoing the injustices by which they had enriched themselves, returning what they had wrongly taken. This giving back of wealth, this restoration of what had been wrongly taken, made Umar many powerful enemies, for it struck directly at the wealth and privilege of the powerful Umayyad family. The members of the ruling family, accustomed to their wealth and their privileges, were angered by Umar's actions, by his taking back of the grants and properties they had accumulated, by his undoing of the arrangements that had enriched them. They complained, they resisted, they grew resentful of the Caliph, who was stripping them of their wealth and privilege for the sake of justice. Umar's justice threatened the powerful, and in threatening them, it made of them dangerous enemies, who would, in the end, conspire against the ruler who had curtailed their wealth and privilege. But Umar was not deterred by the anger of the powerful, for he placed justice above the interests of his family, above even his own safety. By the accounts, when his family complained of his actions, when they protested the loss of their wealth and privilege, Umar held firm, insisting on the justice of restoring what had been wrongly taken, refusing to enrich his family at the expense of the people. He would not, for the sake of his family's wealth or his own safety, abandon the justice he believed he was bound to uphold. He placed justice above all else, above the interests of his family, above the goodwill of the powerful, above even his own safety, holding firm in the giving back of wealth and the restoration of what had been wrongly taken, whatever the cost to himself. Beyond the giving back of wealth, Umar's reign was marked by a great program of reform, an effort to restore justice and righteous governance to the empire, to address the injustices and discontents that had troubled it, to govern according to the principles of the faith. In his short reign of only some 2.5 years, Umar instituted reforms of remarkable scope, addressing the great injustices of his age, working to create a more just and equitable governance. The giving back of wealth, the restoration of what had been wrongly taken, was among the most remarkable and courageous of Umar's acts, and it deserves our deeper consideration, for it reveals the depth of his justice and the courage of his commitment to it, even against the interests of his own family. We have noted that Umar, on becoming Caliph, set about to give back the wealth that he and his family had accumulated, to restore to their rightful owners the lands and properties that had been wrongly taken. Let us consider the magnitude and the courage of this. The Umayyad family had, over the years, accumulated great wealth and vast estates, much of it acquired through the abuse of their power, the seizure of properties, the taking of what did not rightfully belong to them. This wealth was the foundation of the family's privilege and power, the source of their luxury and their position. And Umar set about to give it back, to restore what had been wrongly taken, even though this meant stripping his own family of their wealth and privilege. Consider first the giving back of his own wealth. Umar had, as a member of the ruling family, accumulated considerable wealth, jewels and treasures and estates, the riches of his privileged position. And on becoming Caliph, he gave this wealth away, placing it into the public treasury, surrendering his private riches to the common good. He did not keep his wealth, did not use his position to preserve or increase it, but gave it back, surrendering the riches of his privileged position for the sake of justice. This was a remarkable act of personal renunciation, the giving back of his own wealth, the surrender of his private riches for the common good. But Umar went further, for he set about to restore the wealth and properties that his whole family had wrongly accumulated, to give back what the Umayyad family had unjustly taken. This was far more difficult and dangerous than the giving back of his own wealth, for it meant taking wealth from the powerful members of his family, undoing the arrangements by which they had enriched themselves, stripping them of the properties and privileges they had wrongly acquired. The members of the family were accustomed to their wealth, attached to their privileges, and they would not surrender them willingly. To give back their wrongly taken wealth was to set himself against his own powerful family, to strip them of what they regarded as their own, to make of them bitter enemies. And yet Umar did this, placing justice above the interests and the goodwill of his own family. He would not allow his family to keep wealth that had been wrongly taken, would not permit the injustice of their unjust gains to stand, even though justice required setting himself against his own powerful relatives. There are accounts of his family protesting his actions, complaining of the loss of their wealth and privilege, even appealing to him through intermediaries to relent. But Umar held firm, insisting on the justice of restoring what had been wrongly taken, refusing to enrich his family at the expense of the people, placing justice above the interests and the goodwill of his own relatives. A profound courage lives in this, in the willingness to set oneself against one's own family for the sake of justice, to strip one's own relatives of their wrongly taken wealth, to make enemies of the powerful for the sake of what is right. It would have been easy and safe for Umar to leave his family's wealth untouched, to allow their unjust gains to stand, to preserve the goodwill of his powerful relatives. Instead, he chose the harder and more dangerous path, the path of justice, setting himself against his own family, stripping them of their wrongly taken wealth, making of them dangerous enemies for the sake of what was right. His commitment to justice was so deep that it overrode even the bonds of family, even the interest of his own safety, even the goodwill of the powerful. This willingness to place justice above the interests of his own family reveals the depth and the genuineness of Umar's commitment to justice. For it is one thing to be just when justice costs us nothing, when it does not threaten our own interests or those of our family. It is another thing entirely to be just when justice requires setting ourselves against our own family, stripping our own relatives of their advantages, making enemies of the powerful. Umar's justice was of this deeper kind, the justice that does not spare even one's own family, that places what is right above the bonds of kinship and the interest of self-preservation. His was a justice tested in the hardest case, the case where justice required acting against his own family, and it proved genuine, holding firm even against the interests of his own relatives. And this giving back, this restoration of what had been wrongly taken even against the interests of his family, was the act that, more than any other, made Umar dangerous enemies that would in the end bring about his death. For in stripping his family of their wrongly taken wealth, he made of them bitter enemies, who would not tolerate the loss of their privilege, who would in the end conspire against the ruler who had curtailed their wealth. Umar's justice, his giving back of what had been wrongly taken, cost him the goodwill of the powerful and, in the end, his life. But he had chosen justice over the interests of his family, over even his own safety, and he held to this choice to the end, giving back what had been wrongly taken whatever the cost to himself. So we may see in Umar's giving back of wealth, in his restoration of what had been wrongly taken even against the interests of his own family, the depth and the courage of his commitment to justice. He placed justice above the wealth and the goodwill of his own family, above even his own safety, stripping his relatives of their wrongly taken wealth for the sake of what was right. It was an act of profound courage and genuine justice, the willingness to set oneself against one's own family for the sake of what is right, and it stands as one of the noblest features of his reign, the just ruler who gave back what had been wrongly taken, even at the cost of his family's goodwill, and in the end, his own life. Among the most important of his reforms was the establishment of justice and equality among the different peoples of the empire, particularly between the Arab Muslims and the non-Arab converts to the faith. Under the previous rulers, the non-Arab converts had been treated as second-class members of the community, taxed unjustly even after their conversion, denied the equality that the faith promised. This was a great injustice and a source of deep discontent, and Umar set about to address it, reforming the system of taxation so that the non-Arab converts were treated equally with the Arab Muslims, granting them the equality that the faith promised. This reform addressed one of the great injustices of the age, establishing equality among the different peoples of the empire, treating all the believers as equal regardless of their origin. Among the most significant and enduring of Umar's reforms was his establishment of justice and equality among the different peoples of the empire, particularly his ending of the unjust treatment of the non-Arab converts to the faith. And this reform deserves our deeper consideration, for it addressed one of the great injustices of his age, and reflected a principle of deep importance. Under the rulers who had preceded Umar, the empire had been marked by a deep inequality between the Arab Muslims and the non-Arab converts to the faith. The Arab Muslims, the original bearers of the faith and the ruling people of the empire, enjoyed privileges and advantages that the non-Arab converts did not. The non-Arab converts, though they had embraced the faith, were often treated as second-class members of the community, denied the full equality that the faith promised, subjected to taxes and burdens from which the Arab Muslims were exempt. This was a deep injustice, for the faith taught the equality of all believers, regardless of their origin, and yet the non-Arab converts were treated as inferior, denied the equality their faith promised them. This inequality was a source of deep discontent in the empire, for the non-Arab converts, who had embraced the faith in good faith, resented their unjust treatment, their relegation to a second-class status, their subjection to burdens from which the Arab Muslims were exempt. The discontent of the non-Arab converts was one of the great tensions of the empire, a source of instability and grievance, a standing injustice that troubled the realm. And it was this injustice that Umar set about to address, establishing the equality of all the believers regardless of their origin, ending the unjust treatment of the non-Arab converts. Umar reformed the system of taxation so that the non-Arab converts were treated equally with the Arab Muslims, ending the unjust burdens laid upon them, granting them the equality that the faith promised. He insisted that all the believers were equal, regardless of their origin, that the non-Arab converts should not be treated as inferior, that the equality the faith taught should be reflected in the governance of the empire. This reform addressed one of the great injustices of his age, establishing the equality of all the believers, ending the unjust treatment of the non-Arab converts, reflecting in the governance of the empire the equality that the faith taught. A principle of deep importance runs through this reform. The principle of the equality of all people regardless of their origin, the refusal to treat any group as inferior on the basis of their birth or ethnicity. Umar insisted on this equality, refused to allow the non-Arab converts to be treated as second class, established the equal treatment of all the believers regardless of their origin. This was a principle of justice rooted in the teaching of his faith, which held all believers to be equal, but it was also a principle of universal importance, the equality of all people regardless of their origin, the refusal to treat any group as inferior on the basis of their birth. Umar's reform reflected this principle, establishing the equal treatment of all regardless of their origin. Consider the importance of this principle, the equality of all people regardless of their origin, which Umar established in his reform. For the treating of some groups as inferior on the basis of their birth or ethnicity, the denial of equality to some on the basis of their origin, has been one of the great injustices of human history, a source of oppression and grievance across the ages. And the principle that Umar established, the equality of all regardless of their origin, the refusal to treat any group as inferior on the basis of their birth, is a principle of profound and enduring importance, the foundation of just treatment for all peoples. Umar established this principle in his reform, ending the unjust treatment of the non-Arab converts, insisting on the equality of all the believers regardless of their origin. This reform had, by the accounts, a significant effect, for it removed a great injustice and a great source of discontent, and it contributed to the spread of the faith, as the non-Arab peoples, now treated with greater equality, embraced the faith in larger numbers. The ending of the unjust treatment of the non-Arab converts, the establishment of their equality, removed a barrier to the faith and a source of grievance, contributing to the spread of the faith among the non-Arab peoples and the integration of the diverse peoples of the empire. The reform was significant in its effects as well as its principle, removing a great injustice and contributing to the integration of the empire's diverse peoples. A deeply admirable quality marks this reform, this establishment of equality, this ending of the unjust treatment of a whole group of people. Umar saw the injustice of the unequal treatment of the non-Arab converts, recognized that it violated the equality the faith taught, and acted to end it, establishing the equality of all the believers regardless of their origin. It was a reform of deep principle and significant effect, addressing one of the great injustices of his age, establishing a principle of enduring importance. And it reflects the depth of Umar's commitment to justice, his concern not merely for his own people, but for all the peoples of the empire, his insistence on the equal treatment of all regardless of their origin. The just ruler established the equality of all the believers, ending the unjust treatment of the non-Arab converts, reflecting in his governance the principle of the equality of all people regardless of their origin. Umar also reformed the system of taxation more broadly, working to make it just and equitable, to end the abuses by which the people had been unjustly taxed, to ensure that the burden of taxation was fairly distributed. He worked to end the corrupt practices by which the people had been exploited, the unjust exactions, the abuses of the tax collectors. He concerned himself with the welfare of the people, with ensuring that they were justly governed and fairly treated, that the burden of the state was not laid unjustly upon them. His tax reforms aimed at justice and equity, at the fair treatment of the people, at the ending of the abuses by which they had been exploited. He removed, too, the corrupt and oppressive governors who had misruled the provinces, replacing them with just and honest men. The empire had been troubled by corrupt and oppressive officials who had abused their power, exploited the people, governed unjustly. Umar set about to remove these corrupt officials, to replace them with men of justice and integrity, to ensure that the provinces were governed justly. This reform of the administration, this replacement of the corrupt with the just, was an important part of his effort to restore righteous governance to the empire, to ensure that the people were justly ruled throughout the vast realm. And Umar instituted programs for the welfare of the people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable, using the resources of the state for the benefit of those in need. He provided for the poor and the destitute, for orphans and the vulnerable, establishing welfare programs to care for those in need. He undertook public works for the benefit of the people, the building of roads and canals and rest houses for travelers, the provision of medical care. He used the resources of the state not for the luxury of the ruling family but for the welfare of the people, the care of the poor and the vulnerable, the provision of public benefits. His concern was for the welfare of all his subjects, particularly the poor and the vulnerable, and he used the resources of the state to provide for their needs. Among the marks of Umar's just rule was his deep concern for the welfare of the people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable, and the programs he instituted for their benefit, using the resources of the state, not for the luxury of the rulers, but for the care of those in need. This concern for the welfare of the people deserves our consideration, for it reflected his understanding of the purpose of his rule. Umar understood his rule, it seems, as a trust for the welfare of the people, a responsibility to care for those he governed, particularly the poor and the vulnerable who could not care for themselves. He did not understand the resources of the state as existing for the luxury of the rulers, to be spent on their pleasures and comforts, but as existing for the welfare of the people, to be used for their benefit, particularly the benefit of those in need. And he acted on this understanding, directing the resources of the state toward the welfare of the people, the care of the poor and the vulnerable, the provision of public benefits. He instituted programs for the care of the poor and the destitute, providing for those who could not provide for themselves, ensuring that the resources of the state reached those in need. He provided for orphans who had lost the support of their parents, ensuring their care and their upbringing. He provided for the vulnerable and the needy of every kind, the poor, the destitute, those who had fallen on hard times, directing the resources of the state toward their care. His concern was for the welfare of all his subjects, but particularly for the poor and the vulnerable, those most in need of the care and protection of a just ruler. He undertook, too, great public works for the benefit of the people, using the resources of the state to build what would serve the common good. He had roads built to ease the movement of the people and the conduct of trade. He had canals dug to bring water to the lands and support agriculture. He had rest houses built for travelers, providing shelter for those who journeyed along the routes of the empire. He provided for medical care, establishing places where the sick could be treated. These public works served the welfare of the people, the common good of the empire, using the resources of the state to build what would benefit all. A clear principle runs through all this: the principle that the resources of the state exist for the welfare of the people, not the luxury of the rulers, that the wealth of the realm should be used for the common good, the care of the people, particularly those in need. Umar acted on this principle, directing the resources of the state toward the welfare of the people, the care of the poor and the vulnerable, the provision of public benefits, rather than the luxury of the ruling family. This principle, that the resources of the state exist for the welfare of the people, was central to his understanding of just rule, and it shaped his use of the wealth of the empire, directing it toward the common good, rather than the luxury of the rulers. Consider the contrast between this understanding of rule and the understanding that had prevailed under the previous rulers, who had used the wealth of the empire for their own luxury and the aggrandizement of their family. The previous rulers had treated the resources of the state, in large measure, as existing for their own benefit, to be spent on their luxury and pleasures, the wealth of the realm serving the comfort of the rulers. Umar reversed this understanding, treating the resources of the state as existing for the welfare of the people, to be used for the common good, the care of those in need, rather than the luxury of the rulers. The contrast reflects the difference between just and unjust rule, between the ruler who uses the resources of the state for the people and the ruler who uses them for himself. This concern for the welfare of the people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable, reflects the deep humanity of Umar's rule, his care for those he governed, his understanding of his rule as a trust for their welfare. He was not a remote and self-serving ruler, concerned only with his own power and luxury, but a ruler deeply concerned for the welfare of his people, particularly those most in need, who directed the resources of the state toward their care. His rule was marked by this humanity, this care for the people, this concern for the poor and the vulnerable, which reflected his understanding of his rule as a trust for the welfare of those he governed. A deeply admirable quality marks this concern for the welfare of the people, this care for the poor and the vulnerable, this understanding of rule as a trust for the welfare of the governed. Umar understood his great power not as existing for his own benefit, but for the welfare of the people. And he acted on this understanding, directing the resources of the state toward the care of those in need, the provision of public benefits, the welfare of all his subjects. His concern for the welfare of the people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable, was among the noblest features of his rule, reflecting the depth of his justice and the humanity of his governance. The just ruler who used the resources of the state for the welfare of the people, rather than the luxury of the rulers. Throughout his reforms, Umar was marked by an extraordinary scrupulousness about the public wealth, an absolute refusal to take for himself or his family even the smallest thing that rightly belonged to the people. He regarded the public treasury as a sacred trust, the wealth of the people, not to be used for the private benefit of the ruler, and he was scrupulous, even to an extraordinary degree, in refusing to take from it anything for himself. There are many beloved stories of this scrupulousness, which we may treasure as expressions of his character, whatever their precise historical truth. It is said that he would not use even the oil of the public treasury for his own private affairs, that when his own personal matters were discussed, he would extinguish the lamp that burned with the public oil, unwilling to use even this small thing for his private concerns. It is said that when his own child was found with an apple taken from the public funds, Umar took it from the child, unwilling to let his family benefit even from a single apple that rightly belonged to the people, though it grieved him to take it from his child. These stories, whatever their precise truth, express the extraordinary scrupulousness of Umar about the public wealth, his absolute refusal to take for himself or his family even the smallest thing that rightly belonged to the people, his regard for the public treasury as a sacred trust not to be touched for private benefit. A deeply striking quality marks this scrupulousness, this extraordinary care not to take even the smallest thing that did not rightfully belong to him. For Umar was the ruler of a vast empire, with its immense wealth at his disposal, and yet he would not take for himself even an apple, even the oil of a lamp, that rightly belonged to the people. His scrupulousness was not a matter of grand gestures but of the smallest things, the apple, the lamp oil, the tiny benefits that a less scrupulous ruler would never have thought twice about taking. And in this scrupulousness about the smallest things, we see the depth of his justice, his absolute refusal to take what did not rightfully belong to him, his regard for the public wealth as a sacred trust to be guarded even in its smallest details. The ruler of a vast empire would not take an apple that belonged to the people, and in this we see the extraordinary depth of his justice and his scrupulousness. The extraordinary scrupulousness of Umar about the public wealth, his absolute refusal to take for himself or his family even the smallest thing that rightly belonged to the people, is among the most striking features of his rule, and the beloved stories that express it deserve our deeper reflection, for they reveal the depth of his justice in the smallest things. We have noted the stories of his scrupulousness, the extinguishing of the lamp that burned with the public oil when his own private affairs were discussed, the taking of the apple from his own child because it had come from the public funds. Let us dwell on these stories, treasuring them as expressions of his character whatever their precise historical truth, for they reveal something profound about the nature of his justice. Consider the story of the lamp. It is said that Umar, when conducting the business of the state, would burn a lamp that used the oil of the public treasury, for this was the legitimate use of the public resources, the conduct of the state's business. But when his own private affairs were to be discussed, when the matter turned from the business of the state to his own personal concerns, he would extinguish the public lamp and light another, unwilling to use even the oil of the public treasury for his own private concerns. The public oil was for the public business. His own affairs must be conducted at his own expense, even down to the oil of a lamp. There is something extraordinary in this scrupulousness about so small a thing as the oil of a lamp. For Umar was the ruler of a vast empire, with its immense wealth at his disposal, and yet he would not use even the oil of a lamp, worth almost nothing, for his own private concerns, if it belonged to the public treasury. The smallness of the thing makes the scrupulousness all the more striking, for it was not in the great matters only but in the smallest details that Umar guarded the public wealth, refusing to take even the most trivial thing that rightly belonged to the people. His justice extended to the smallest things, the oil of a lamp, guarding the public wealth even in its most trivial details. Consider, too, the story of the apple. It is said that Umar's young child once took an apple from the public funds, as a child might, not understanding the wrong, and Umar, seeing this, took the apple from the child, unwilling to let his family benefit even from a single apple that rightly belonged to the people. By the accounts, it grieved him to take the apple from his child, for he loved his child, and it pained him to deny him. But his justice would not permit even his own child to benefit from what rightly belonged to the people, even so small a thing as a single apple. He took the apple from his beloved child, though it grieved him, because justice required it, because even a single apple from the public funds was not his family's to take. A deeply moving quality fills this story, in the image of the ruler taking an apple from his own beloved child for the sake of justice, grieved to do it yet unwilling to let even his child benefit from what rightly belonged to the people. It reveals the depth of his justice, which would not spare even his own beloved child, which guarded the public wealth even against his own family, even in so small a thing as an apple. And it reveals, too, the cost of his justice, the grief it caused him to deny his own child, the hard sacrifice that his scrupulousness required even of his own family's affections. His justice was not cheap or easy, but cost him even the pain of denying his beloved child a single apple. These stories, the lamp and the apple, whatever their precise historical truth, express the extraordinary depth of Umar's justice, his scrupulousness about the public wealth even in the smallest things, his refusal to take for himself or his family even the most trivial thing that rightly belonged to the people. They reveal a justice that extended to the smallest details, that guarded the public wealth even in things worth almost nothing, that would not permit even his own child to benefit from a single apple of the public funds. It was a justice of extraordinary depth and scrupulousness, reaching to the smallest things, sparing not even his own family, guarding the public wealth as a sacred trust even in its most trivial details. Consider what this extraordinary scrupulousness reveals about the nature of true justice, true integrity. For it is in the smallest things, perhaps, that true integrity is most tested and most revealed. Many might be just in the great matters, where justice is conspicuous and its violation would be noticed, while being careless in the small things, where no one would notice a minor taking. But Umar was scrupulous even in the smallest things, the oil of a lamp, a single apple, where no one would have noticed or objected to a minor taking. And this scrupulousness in the smallest things reveals the depth and the genuineness of his justice, which was not a matter of conspicuous gestures, but of consistent integrity, extending even to the smallest details, guarding the public wealth even where no one would have noticed its taking. So we should see in these beloved stories, the lamp and the apple, the extraordinary depth of Umar's justice, his scrupulousness about the public wealth even in the smallest things, his integrity that extended even to the most trivial details. The ruler of a vast empire would not use the oil of a lamp or take an apple that belonged to the people. And in this extraordinary scrupulousness, we see the depth and the genuineness of his justice, an integrity that reached to the smallest things, that guarded the public wealth as a sacred trust, even in its most trivial details. It is one of the most striking features of his rule, this scrupulousness in the smallest things, and it reveals the extraordinary depth of the justice for which he is revered across the centuries. Through all these reforms, the establishment of equality, the reform of taxation, the removal of corrupt officials, the programs of welfare, the scrupulous guarding of the public wealth, Umar worked to restore justice and righteous governance to the empire, to create a more just and equitable rule, to govern according to the principles of the faith. In his short reign, he accomplished a remarkable program of reform, addressing the great injustices of his age, working to create a governance marked by justice, equality, and concern for the welfare of the people. It was a reign of justice and reform unmatched among the rulers of his dynasty, a brief but extraordinary effort to restore righteous governance to the vast empire. But Umar's justice and reform, for all the good they did the people, made him dangerous enemies among the powerful, and these enemies would, in the end, bring about his death. For his reforms struck directly at the wealth and privilege of the powerful members of the ruling family, who had grown rich on the abuses that Umar now undid, who lost their grants and their wrongly taken properties, who saw their wealth and privilege curtailed by the just Caliph. These powerful figures, angered by the loss of their wealth and privilege, resentful of the Caliph who had stripped them of their unjust gains, grew into dangerous enemies, who would not tolerate the continued rule of the reformer who threatened their interests. Umar was not only a just ruler but a scholar of learning, deeply versed in the religious sciences of his faith, and his learning shaped his rule and led him to one act of lasting significance for the preservation of his faith's knowledge. This dimension of his life, the scholar-ruler, deserves our consideration. We have noted that Umar received a thorough religious education in Medina, the great center of the faith's scholarship, becoming himself a scholar of some learning, deeply versed in the religious sciences. This learning was not set aside when he became a ruler but remained central to him, shaping his understanding of his rule. providing the principles on which his just governance was based. He was a scholar ruler, one whose rule was grounded in religious learning, who governed according to the principles of the faith as he understood them through his learning. His justice was not merely a matter of temperament but of principle, grounded in his religious learning, his understanding of what the faith required of a ruler. Umar surrounded himself, as ruler, with scholars and learned men, seeking their counsel, valuing their learning, drawing on their knowledge in his governance. He had, even as governor, formed a council of pious and learned men to advise him, and as Caliph he continued to value the counsel of the learned, surrounding himself with scholars, seeking their advice, governing in consultation with the devout and learned. He honored learning, supported scholars, encouraged education, valuing the religious knowledge that he believed should guide the governance of the faith. The scholar ruler honored and supported learning, drawing on it in his governance, encouraging it among his people. And Umar is credited with one act of lasting significance for the preservation of his faith's knowledge: the ordering of the first official collection of the traditions of the Prophet, the precious records of what the Prophet had said and done. By the accounts, Umar, concerned that the traditions might be lost as the generations who remembered them passed away, ordered that they be collected and written down, that this precious knowledge be preserved before it could be lost. He commissioned scholars to gather and record the traditions, initiating the official collection of this precious knowledge, ensuring its preservation for the generations to come. This was an act of lasting significance, for the traditions of the Prophet were among the most precious knowledge of the faith, and their preservation was of the greatest importance. By ordering their collection and recording, Umar helped to ensure the preservation of this precious knowledge, initiating the official effort to gather and record the traditions before they could be lost. The great collections of the traditions that would later be compiled, the precious records of the faith's foundational knowledge, owed something to this early effort that Umar initiated, the ordering of the collection of the traditions to preserve them for the future. It was an act of foresight and devotion to the preservation of his faith's knowledge, of lasting significance for the generations to come. A fitting quality marks this, that the scholar ruler should have concerned himself with the preservation of his faith's precious knowledge, should have used his power to ensure that the traditions were collected and preserved. His learning made him aware of the value of this knowledge and the danger of its loss, and his power enabled him to act to preserve it, ordering the collection of the traditions, ensuring their recording for the future. The scholar ruler used his power in the service of his learning, to preserve the precious knowledge of his faith, an act that united his scholarship and his rule in the service of the preservation of his faith's foundational knowledge. Consider the value of this concern for the preservation of knowledge, this foresight in ensuring that precious knowledge was not lost. For knowledge, once lost, can be difficult or impossible to recover, and the preservation of precious knowledge for future generations is a matter of lasting importance. Umar showed this foresight, this concern for the preservation of knowledge, ordering the collection of the traditions to ensure that this precious knowledge was not lost as the generations who remembered it passed away. His foresight helped to preserve the precious knowledge of his faith for the generations to come, an act of lasting significance that reflected his learning and his concern for the preservation of knowledge. And we might reflect, too, on the union of learning and power in Umar's rule, the way his scholarship grounded and guided his governance, the way his power served his learning in the preservation of knowledge. He was a scholar ruler, one whose rule was grounded in religious learning, whose justice was a matter of principle rooted in his understanding of the faith, who used his power in the service of learning and the preservation of knowledge. This union of learning and power, of scholarship and rule, was among the marks of his governance, grounding his justice in principle, guiding his rule by learning, using his power in the service of knowledge. The scholar ruler united learning and power in his governance, his scholarship grounding his justice and his power, serving the preservation of his faith's precious knowledge. And so, by the accounts, these enemies conspired against Umar, and brought about his death by poison. It is related that one of his own servants was bribed, by those who wished him dead, to administer poison to the Caliph, and that Umar, having taken the poison, fell mortally ill. We will not dwell on the details, for the simple fact is sorrowful enough. The just ruler, who had given back wealth and restored what had been wrongly taken, who had governed for the welfare of the people, was murdered by those whose unjust privileges he had curtailed, poisoned by the agents of the powerful whom his justice had threatened. His justice had made him enemies, and his enemies, in the end, took his life. A beloved account tells how Umar responded when he understood that he had been poisoned, which reveals the depth of his character. It is said that when he learned who had administered the poison, the servant who had been bribed to kill him, he did not seek vengeance, but forgave the man. By the accounts, he summoned the servant and asked why he had done it. And the servant confessed that he had been bribed with a sum of money. Umar, by the accounts, took the money and placed it in the public treasury, and then freed the servant, telling him to flee, to go away to safety, lest the Caliph's family take vengeance on him after Umar's death. He forgave his own murderer, sought no vengeance, and even acted to protect the man from the vengeance of others. Whatever the precise truth of this account, it expresses the extraordinary character of Umar, his forgiveness even of his own murderer, his freedom from vengeance even toward the one who had taken his life. And so, around the year 720, after a reign of only some 2.5 years, Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz died, by the accounts of the poison administered by his enemies, at about 39 years of age. We will not invent the scene of his passing, nor adorn it with marvels, for the simple facts are dignified enough. The just ruler, who had given back wealth and governed for the welfare of the people, came at last to the end of his short but extraordinary reign, dying young, murdered by those whose unjust privileges he had curtailed, forgiving even his killer as he lay dying. It was a sorrowful end to a noble life, the murder of the just ruler by the agents of the powerful, but it was an end faithful to the justice and the forgiveness that had marked his life. The end of Umar's life, his death at the hands of those whose unjust privileges he had curtailed, and his forgiveness of his own murderer, deserves our deeper reflection, for it reveals both the cost of his justice and the depth of his character, faithful to the end even unto the forgiveness of the one who took his life. We have noted that Umar's justice and reform made him dangerous enemies among the powerful, particularly the members of his own family, whose wrongly taken wealth he had restored, whose privileges he had curtailed. These powerful figures, angered by the loss of their wealth and privilege, resentful of the just ruler who had stripped them of their unjust gains, grew into dangerous enemies. And in the end, by the accounts, they brought about his death, bribing a servant to administer poison to the Caliph, taking the life of the ruler whose justice had threatened their interests. Something sorrowful, and yet also revealing, lives in this, that Umar's very justice should have brought about his death, that his goodness should have made him the enemies who killed him. For it was not any wrong that Umar did that brought about his death, but his justice, his righteousness, his giving back of what had been wrongly taken. His enemies hated him not for his faults but for his virtues, not for any injustice but for his justice, which threatened their unjust privileges. The just ruler was killed for his justice, the righteous ruler for his righteousness, the goodness of his rule making him the enemies who took his life. There is a sorrowful truth in this, that justice and righteousness can make enemies of the unjust and the unrighteous, that the good ruler may be hated and even killed for his very goodness. This reveals the cost of Umar's justice, the price he paid for his righteousness. For his justice was not without cost, not a safe and easy righteousness, but a justice that made dangerous enemies, that threatened the powerful, that in the end cost him his life. He had chosen justice over the goodwill of the powerful, over the interests of his family, over even his own safety, and the cost of this choice was, in the end, his life. His justice cost him dearly, made him enemies, brought about his death, and yet he had chosen it, held to it, maintained it whatever the cost. The cost of his justice was his life, and he paid it, faithful to his righteousness to the end. And yet, even as he paid this cost, even as he lay dying from the poison administered by his enemies, Umar revealed the depth of his character in his response, his forgiveness of his own murderer. We have noted the beloved account of how he summoned the servant who had poisoned him, asked why he had done it, and learned that he had been bribed. And rather than seeking vengeance, Umar forgave the man, took the bribe money, and placed it in the public treasury, and freed the servant, telling him to flee to safety lest the Caliph's family take vengeance on him. He forgave his own murderer, sought no vengeance, and even acted to protect the man from the vengeance of others. An extraordinary quality marks this forgiveness, this freedom from vengeance even toward the one who had taken his life. For the desire for vengeance against those who wrong us is among the most powerful of human impulses, and the desire for vengeance against one's own murderer would be powerful indeed. And yet Umar, even as he lay dying from the poison the servant had administered, felt no desire for vengeance, but forgave the man, and even acted to protect him. His forgiveness reveals an extraordinary depth of character, a freedom from vengeance, a magnanimity, even toward his own murderer, that few could attain. Even in death, even toward the one who had killed him, Umar was faithful to the magnanimity and the justice that had marked his life. Consider the depth of character revealed in this forgiveness, this freedom from vengeance even toward one's own murderer. For it reveals a soul free of the desire for vengeance, magnanimous even toward those who had done it the greatest wrong, faithful to forgiveness and mercy, even in the face of death. Umar's forgiveness of his murderer was the final expression of the character that had marked his whole life, the justice, the magnanimity, the freedom from the baser human impulses that had characterized his rule. Even in death, he was faithful to this character, forgiving his murderer, seeking no vengeance, magnanimous even toward the one who had taken his life. It was a fitting end to a life of justice and magnanimity. The forgiveness of his murderer the final expression of his noble character. And there is something that consoles, even in the sorrow of his death, in this forgiveness, this faithfulness to magnanimity and justice even unto the end. For though his death was sorrowful, the murder of the just ruler by the agents of the powerful, his response to it was noble. The forgiveness of his murderer, the faithfulness to magnanimity even in death. His death revealed, in his response to it, the depth of his character, the genuineness of his justice and magnanimity, faithful even in the face of death, even toward the one who had killed him. The sorrow of his death is tempered by the nobility of his response to it, the forgiveness of his murderer, the faithfulness to justice and magnanimity even unto the end of his life. So we may see in the end of Umar's life, in his death at the hands of his enemies and his forgiveness of his murderer, both the cost of his justice and the depth of his character. His justice cost him his life, made him the enemies who killed him, the price of his righteousness paid in his death. And yet, even as he paid this cost, he revealed the depth of his character in his forgiveness of his murderer, his freedom from vengeance, his faithfulness to magnanimity and justice, even unto death. The just ruler was killed for his justice, but he met his death with forgiveness and magnanimity, faithful to the end to the noble character that had marked his life, even unto the forgiveness of the one who took his life. He was buried, by the accounts, in the region where he died, in Syria, and his resting place came to be honored in his memory. We mention this gently and with respect, as the simple fact of how he has been remembered. For our story is of his life and his justice rather than of the honors paid after his death. It is enough to know that the just ruler came at last to his rest, his short but extraordinary reign complete, his life of justice and reform faithful to the end, even unto the forgiveness of his murderer. Umar's reign had been short, only some 2.5 years, and after his death, his reforms were largely undone, for his successors among the Umayyad rulers reversed many of his policies, restoring the privileges he had curtailed, undoing the reforms he had instituted. In this sense, his work did not endure, for the justice he had established was rolled back after his death, the privileges he had curtailed restored, the reforms he had instituted undone. The powerful who had resented his justice regained their privileges, and the empire returned, in large measure, to the ways that had prevailed before his reign. And yet, though his reforms were undone, his memory and his example endured, far beyond the brief span of his reign, becoming one of the most revered in the history of his civilization. For Umar came to be remembered as the great exception among the rulers of his dynasty, the one just and pious ruler among rulers known for the pursuit of power and wealth, the one who had governed for the welfare of the people rather than the aggrandizement of his family. He came to be regarded as a kind of fifth among the rightly guided caliphs, the early successors held to have ruled with exemplary justice, so revered was he for his justice and his piety. His memory became a standard of just rule, an example of what a ruler could and should be, revered across the centuries as one of the most just rulers in the history of his civilization. A real significance marks the way Umar's example endured though his reforms were undone, his memory revered though his work was reversed. For it suggests that the example of justice, the memory of righteous rule, can endure and inspire even when the particular reforms do not last, that the witness of a just life can outlast the undoing of its particular achievements. Umar's reforms were reversed, but his example endured, becoming a standard of just rule, an inspiration to those who longed for righteous governance, a memory revered across the centuries. The justice he embodied outlasted the reforms he instituted, his example proving more enduring than his particular achievements. There is a poignant truth about Umar's reign that deserves our reflection, that it was so short, only some 2.5 years, and that his reforms were largely undone after his death, and yet that his example endured and his memory was revered as few have been. This relationship between the brevity of his reign, the undoing of his reforms, and the endurance of his example holds a deep lesson worth pondering. Consider first the brevity of his reign. Umar ruled for only some 2.5 years, a very short time in which to govern a vast empire and to institute lasting reforms. He came to power, instituted his remarkable program of reform, and died, all within the span of 2.5 years. It was a brief reign, cut short by his murder, far too short to establish lasting institutions or to secure the permanence of his reforms. We cannot help but wonder what he might have accomplished had he ruled longer, what lasting changes he might have made had his reign not been cut short. But his reign was brief, only 2.5 years, ended by his murder while still a young man. Consider, too, the undoing of his reforms. After Umar's death, his successors among the Umayyad rulers reversed many of his policies, restoring the privileges he had curtailed, undoing the reforms he had instituted. The powerful who had resented his justice regained their privileges. The reforms he had instituted were rolled back. The empire returned, in large measure, to the ways that had prevailed before his reign. In this sense, his work did not endure, his reforms did not last, the justice he had established was reversed after his death. His particular achievements, the reforms he had instituted, were largely undone, the work of his brief reign reversed by his successors. And yet, despite the brevity of his reign and the undoing of his reforms, Umar's example endured, and his memory was revered as few have been. He came to be remembered as one of the most just rulers in the history of his civilization, regarded as a kind of fifth among the rightly guided caliphs, his memory revered across the centuries as a standard of just rule. Though his reign was brief and his reforms undone, his example endured, his memory revered, his name honored across the centuries as one of the most just rulers his civilization had known. The brevity of his reign and the undoing of his reforms did not diminish the endurance of his example and the reverence of his memory. A profound lesson lives in this, about the endurance of example over achievement, the way that the witness of a just life can outlast the undoing of its particular accomplishments. Umar's particular achievements, his reforms, were undone after his death, reversed by his successors, not enduring as lasting institutions. But his example, the witness of his just life, endured, revered across the centuries, inspiring those who longed for righteous rule, becoming a standard of just governance. The example outlasted the achievement, the witness of the just life outlasted the particular reforms, the memory of righteous rule endured, though the reforms were reversed. This suggests that the deepest and most lasting influence may lie not in particular achievements, which may be undone, but in the example of a life, which may endure. Umar's reforms were undone, but his example endured, and it was through his example, more than his particular achievements, that his lasting influence flowed. The witness of his just life, his example of righteous rule, proved more enduring than his particular reforms, inspiring and instructing across the centuries, though the reforms themselves were reversed. The deepest influence lay in the example, the witness of the just life, which endured though the particular achievements did not. Encouragement lives in this for any who labor for justice or righteousness and see their particular achievements undone, their reforms reversed, their work not enduring as they had hoped. For Umar's example shows that the witness of a just life can endure even when its particular achievements do not, that the example of righteousness can inspire across the centuries even when the particular reforms are reversed. The labor for justice is not wasted even when its particular achievements are undone, for the example endures, the witness of the just life inspires, the memory of righteousness is revered, even when the particular reforms do not last. Umar's brief reign and undone reforms yet left an enduring example, and this offers encouragement to all who labor for justice and see their achievements undone. So we may see in the brevity of Umar's reign and the undoing of his reforms, joined to the endurance of his example, a profound lesson about the endurance of example over achievement. His reign was brief, his reforms undone, and yet his example endured, his memory revered across the centuries as a standard of just rule. The witness of his just life outlasted the undoing of his particular reforms, proving that the deepest and most lasting influence may lie in the example of a life rather than in particular achievements that may be undone. Umar's enduring example, outlasting his brief reign and undone reforms, testifies to the lasting power of the witness of a just life, an example that has inspired and instructed across the centuries though the reforms themselves did not endure. And here we begin to see the deepest meaning of his life, the thing that makes it endure beyond all the particulars of his reign and his reforms. His life was, above all, a witness to just and righteous rule, to the use of power for the welfare of others rather than the aggrandizement of oneself, to the giving back of what others sought to take. He held the supreme power of a vast empire, with all its wealth at his disposal, and he used it not for himself or his family, but for the welfare of the people, giving back his wealth, restoring what had been wrongly taken, governing with justice and concern for all his subjects. His life was a witness to what power could be when it was held justly, used for others rather than oneself, exercised as a trust rather than seized as a prize. There is a lesson in this that reaches across the centuries to each of us who hears it, whatever measure of power or advantage we may hold. It is the lesson of just stewardship, of the use of power for others rather than oneself, of the giving back rather than the taking, of the holding of whatever advantage we have as a trust to be used for the good of others. Umar held the greatest power, and used it as a trust for the welfare of the people, giving back rather than taking, serving rather than being served. And his example calls us, whatever power or advantage we hold, to use it justly, for the good of others, as a trust rather than a possession, giving rather than taking, serving rather than seeking our own advantage. As we draw toward the close of his story, let us reflect on what Umar's example of just rule might mean for us in our own very different age. For though few of us are rulers of empires, his example speaks to all who hold any measure of power or responsibility over the welfare of others. At the very center of Umar's example is the understanding of power as a trust, to be used for the welfare of others, rather than the aggrandizement of oneself. He understood his rule not as a possession to be enjoyed but as a responsibility to be discharged, not as a prize to be exploited but as a trust for which he would answer, the welfare of the people committed to his care. And he acted on this understanding, using his power for the welfare of the people, giving back his wealth, governing with justice, treating his rule as a trust rather than a possession. This understanding of power as a trust, to be used for others rather than oneself, is the heart of his example, and it speaks to all who hold any measure of power or responsibility. For while few of us are rulers of empires, all of us hold some measure of power or responsibility, some position in which we affect the welfare of others, some authority over others' lives or well-being. We may be employers or officials, parents or teachers, leaders or managers, holders of some authority over others. And in whatever position we hold, the question that Umar's example poses is the same. Whether we use our power for ourselves or for others, whether we treat it as a possession to be exploited for our own benefit or as a trust to be discharged for the welfare of those it affects. Umar's example calls us to the latter, to understand whatever power we hold as a trust, to use it for the welfare of others, rather than our own aggrandizement. We live in our own age, in a time when power is often used for the benefit of those who hold it, when positions of authority are often exploited for personal advantage, when the powerful often serve themselves rather than those they are meant to serve. The abuse of power for personal benefit, the exploitation of position for private advantage, the self-serving use of authority, are common in our age as in Umar's. And against this, Umar's example stands as a rebuke and an inspiration. The ruler who used his power not for himself but for others, who gave back rather than took, who treated his authority as a trust for the welfare of those it affected. His example calls us, in our own age, to a different use of power, the use of power for others rather than oneself, the treating of authority as a trust rather than a possession. We might learn from Umar's example, then, whatever power or responsibility we hold, to use it justly, for the welfare of others, as a trust rather than a possession. We might learn his scrupulousness about taking for ourselves what rightly belongs to others, his refusal to exploit his position for personal benefit, his care to use his power for the welfare of those it affected. We might learn his willingness to place justice above his own interest, even above the interest of his family, his readiness to do what was right whatever the cost to himself. We might learn his understanding of power as a trust, to be discharged for the welfare of others, for which he would answer. These lessons of just stewardship, of the use of power for others, speak to all who hold any measure of power or responsibility, in any age. And we might reflect, too, on the deeper source of Umar's just rule, the seriousness with which he regarded his accountability, his sense that he would answer for how he used his power. For it was this sense of accountability, this understanding that he would answer for his rule, that grounded his justice, that led him to use his power for others rather than himself. He governed as one who would give an account of his governance, who would answer for how he had used his power, and this sense of accountability grounded his justice and his care for the welfare of the people. There is wisdom in this, in the sense of accountability for how we use whatever power we hold, the understanding that we will answer for our stewardship, which can ground our justice and our care for the welfare of those our power affects. To contemplate this example of just rule, as the night deepens, is itself a kind of clarification, a turning of the mind toward the just use of power, the treating of authority as a trust, the care for the welfare of others. There is something elevating in the contemplation of such justice, such righteous use of power, such care for the welfare of the people, that may inspire us toward a juster use of whatever power we hold. Umar embodied this just rule more fully than almost any ruler, and his example calls us toward it, the use of power for others rather than oneself, the treating of authority as a trust, the care for the welfare of those our power affects. So as the night settles around you, and your thoughts grow still, you might carry with you a little of Umar's spirit, his justice, his care for the welfare of others, his understanding of power as a trust. Not as a burden, but as a quiet inspiration, a glimpse of what power can be when it is used justly, for the welfare of others rather than oneself. The Caliph who gave everything back, who held the greatest power and used it for others, who governed with justice and died forgiving his murderer, has finished his short but extraordinary reign, and his example of just rule remains, across the centuries, a quiet light, calling us to use whatever power we hold justly, for the welfare of others, as a trust rather than a possession, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. Let us try for a moment to picture the texture of Umar's life as Caliph, the lived reality of his days as the just ruler, for behind the great reforms and the famous stories lay a person, living a life of remarkable simplicity amid the greatest power, and it helps us to see him more truly. We might imagine, first, the contrast between the life Umar might have lived as Caliph and the life he chose to live. As ruler of the vast empire, he might have lived in the greatest luxury, surrounded by every comfort, attended by servants, adorned with the finest things, enjoying the immense wealth at his disposal. This was how rulers of vast empires commonly lived, and how the other rulers of his dynasty had lived, in luxury and magnificence befitting their power. But Umar chose a different life, a life of remarkable simplicity, setting aside the luxury his position offered, living more humbly than many of his subjects, in a simplicity that astonished those accustomed to the luxury of rulers. His days, we may imagine, were ordered around the business of his rule and his devotion to God. There would have been the work of governance, the long hours given to the administration of the empire, the hearing of complaints, the dispensing of justice, the oversight of his reforms, the great labor of ruling a vast realm justly. There would have been his devotion, his prayer and remembrance of God, the religious practice that grounded his rule and expressed his piety. And there would have been, woven through it all, the simplicity of his way of life, free of the luxury his position offered, marked by the austerity he had chosen. His was a life of labor and devotion and simplicity, the just ruler giving his days to the governance of the empire and the worship of God, living in a simplicity that set aside the luxury of his position. The accounts relate many details of this simplicity, the austerity of his life as Caliph, which we may treasure as expressions of his character. It is said that he wore simple garments, ate simple food, lived in humble circumstances, refusing the luxury his position offered. It is said that he labored long at the business of his rule, giving himself to the just governance of the empire, sparing no effort in the discharge of his responsibilities. It is said that he was accessible to his people, hearing their complaints, dispensing justice, attending to their welfare, rather than remaining remote in royal luxury. These details, whatever their precise truth, express the texture of his rule, the simplicity and the labor, and the accessibility of the just ruler. A striking quality marks this simplicity amid the greatest power, this austerity in the midst of immense wealth. For Umar held the supreme power of a vast empire, with its immense wealth at his disposal, and yet he lived in simplicity, set aside the luxury his position offered, chose austerity amid the wealth he might have enjoyed. The contrast between his immense power and his simple life is striking. The ruler of a vast empire living more humbly than many of his subjects, the holder of immense wealth choosing austerity. This simplicity amid power, this austerity amid wealth, was among the marks of his rule, reflecting his understanding of his power as a trust rather than a possession, his refusal to use his position for his own luxury. Consider this simplicity amid power, this choosing of austerity amid wealth, for it reflects a freedom from the love of luxury that often accompanies and corrupts power. For power and wealth often bring luxury, and the love of luxury can corrupt the powerful, leading them to use their position for their own comfort and pleasure, rather than the welfare of those they govern. Umar was free of this corruption, choosing simplicity amid power, austerity amid wealth, refusing to use his position for his own luxury. His freedom from the love of luxury, his choice of simplicity amid power, reflected the purity of his rule, his understanding of his power as a trust for the welfare of others rather than a means to his own comfort. And we might reflect, too, on the labor and the accessibility of his rule, the way he gave himself to the just governance of the empire and remained accessible to his people. For he did not hold his power remotely, enjoying its privileges while neglecting its responsibilities, but gave himself to the labor of just governance, the hearing of complaints, the dispensing of justice, the attending to the welfare of his people. He was an accessible ruler, available to his people, attending to their complaints and their welfare, rather than remaining remote in royal luxury. His labor and his accessibility reflected his understanding of his rule as a service to the people, a responsibility to be discharged through diligent labor and attention to their welfare. So picture Umar as Caliph, living a life of remarkable simplicity amid the greatest power, giving his days to the labor of just governance and the worship of God, accessible to his people, free of the love of luxury that often corrupts the powerful. It is a picture of just rule in its lived reality. The simplicity amid power, the labor of governance, the accessibility to the people, the devotion to God, that marked the daily life of the just ruler. And it helps us to see him more truly, not merely as the figure of the famous stories and the great reforms, but as a person living a life of simplicity and labor and devotion amid the greatest power. The just ruler whose daily life reflected his understanding of his power as a trust for the welfare of the people. It is worth pausing, before we let his story rest, to consider why the memory of Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz has been so cherished across the centuries, revered far beyond the brief span of his reign, honored as one of the most just rulers his civilization had known. For the reverence accorded to him reveals something about the deep human longing for just rule. In every age, in every land, people have longed for just rule, for rulers who would govern with justice and care for the welfare of the people, rather than their own aggrandizement. And in every age, this longing has so often been disappointed, for rulers have so often governed unjustly, using their power for themselves, exploiting their position, neglecting the welfare of the people. The longing for just rule is among the deepest of human political longings, and its disappointment is among the most common of human political experiences. People long for just rulers and so often find unjust ones, long for governance that serves the people and so often find governance that serves the rulers. It is against this background, this deep longing for just rule so often disappointed, that the memory of Umar has been so cherished. For Umar was the rare ruler who answered the longing for just rule, who governed with justice and care for the welfare of the people, who used his power for others rather than himself. In a world where just rulers were rare and the longing for just rule so often disappointed, Umar stood out as the rare answer to that longing, the just ruler who governed for the people, who gave back rather than took, who treated his power as a trust, and his memory has been cherished across the centuries as the embodiment of the just rule that people long for, the rare ruler who answered the deep longing for justice in governance. There is something poignant in this, in the way that the rarity of just rule has made the memory of the just ruler so precious. For if just rule were common, if rulers commonly governed with justice and care for the people, the memory of any one just ruler might not be so cherished. But because just rule is rare, because the longing for it is so often disappointed, the memory of the rare ruler who answered that longing becomes precious, cherished as the embodiment of what people long for, but so rarely find. The rarity of just rule has made the memory of Umar precious, cherished across the centuries as the rare embodiment of the just rule that people long for. And Umar's memory has served, across the centuries, as a standard of just rule, an example against which rulers might be measured, an inspiration to those who longed for righteous governance. His example has stood as a reminder of what rule could and should be, a standard of justice against which the conduct of rulers might be judged, an inspiration to those who hoped for just governance. The memory of the just ruler has served, in this way, not merely as a cherished memory, but as a living standard and inspiration, reminding each age of what just rule could be, inspiring the longing for righteous governance, providing a measure against which rulers might be judged. We might reflect on the value of such examples, such memories of just rule, for the political life of every age. For the longing for just rule needs examples to sustain it, embodiments of the justice it longs for, standards against which to measure the conduct of rulers. The memory of Umar, and of others like him, provides such examples, sustaining the longing for just rule, embodying the justice that people long for, providing standards against which to measure their rulers. These examples of just rule, cherished across the centuries, serve the political life of every age, sustaining the longing for justice, embodying its possibility, providing standards and inspiration for those who hope for righteous governance. So we may understand the reverence accorded to Umar across the centuries as a reflection of the deep human longing for just rule, and of the rarity of its fulfillment. He answered the longing for just rule that so often goes unfulfilled, governed with the justice that people long for but so rarely find, and his memory has been cherished, across the centuries, as the embodiment of that longed-for justice, a standard and an inspiration for those who hope for righteous governance. The reverence accorded to him reveals the depth of the human longing for just rule, and the preciousness of the rare ruler who answers it, cherished across the centuries as the embodiment of the justice that people long for in those who govern them. Let us pause, before we let his story rest, to hold in our minds the central image of his life, the image that gathers up its meaning, a ruler of the greatest power, seated not in luxury but in simplicity, setting aside the wealth of an empire, giving back what others sought to seize, governing not for himself but for the welfare of the people, treating his immense power as a trust rather than a possession. There is, in this image, something that speaks to the deepest part of us, the recognition of power used justly, of authority held as a trust, of the giving back rather than the taking. For we live in a world where power is so often used for the benefit of those who hold it, where authority is so often exploited for private advantage, where the powerful so often serve themselves rather than those they are meant to serve. And against this, the image of Umar stands as a rebuke and an inspiration, the ruler of a vast empire who used his power not for himself but for others, who gave back rather than took, who treated his authority as a trust for the welfare of the people. He shows us what power can be when it is used justly, the good that a ruler can do when he governs for others rather than himself. He shows us, too, that such justice is possible even amid the greatest temptations, even for one raised in luxury and holding immense power. Umar was raised in privilege, accustomed to luxury, holder of the supreme power of a vast empire, with every temptation to use his power for himself. And yet he chose justice, chose to give back rather than take, chose to govern for others rather than himself, even against the interests of his own family, even at the cost of his life. His example shows that justice is possible even amid the greatest temptations, that the just use of power is achievable even for one with every temptation to use it for himself. So as the night deepens and your thoughts grow still, you might carry with you a little of his spirit, his justice, his treating of power as a trust, his giving back rather than taking, not as a burden, but as a quiet inspiration, a glimpse of what power can be when it is used justly, for the welfare of others. The Caliph who gave everything back, who held the greatest power and used it for others, who governed with justice and died forgiving his murderer, has finished his short but extraordinary reign. And his example of just rule remains, across the centuries, a quiet light, calling us to use whatever power we hold justly, for the welfare of others, as a trust rather than a possession, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. And here we return, at the last, to the quiet question his life poses to each of us who hears it. He held great power, and used it not for himself but for others, giving back rather than taking, governing as a trust rather than a prize. His life asks us, gently, about our own use of whatever power or advantage we hold, about whether we use it for ourselves or for others, whether we take or give, whether we hold it as a possession or as a trust. It is a searching question, and a valuable one, and his life poses it with all the power of his extraordinary example of just rule. There is no need to answer that question tonight. Some questions are not meant to be solved quickly, but to be carried gently, turned over slowly, lived with over a long while. Let it rest beside you now, softly, asking nothing of you but a moment's quiet reflection. The Caliph who gave everything back, who held the greatest power and used it for others, who governed with justice and died forgiving his murderer, has finished his own short but extraordinary reign, and you have followed it, gently, all the way to its peaceful end. So let your thoughts grow still. Let the great empire fade into the dark, with its capital in Damascus and its vast lands across 3 continents, and the just ruler who set aside his luxury, who gave back his wealth, who governed for the welfare of the people. Let the names and the dates drift away, for they have done their work. What remains is only the quiet, and the question, and the calm of the gathering night. May your mind grow easy, may your heart be untroubled, and may your rest, tonight, be deep and peaceful and kind.